Welcome to another episode of the Ginger Romance. Here, you'll hear anonymous stories from travellers all over the world. Real submissions from real people. Tales of connection, romance, passion, heartbreak, friendship, and love in all its forms. Because every kind of love deserves to be told. This week on the Ginger Romance, we share a friendship story from Yogyakarta, Indonesia. What began as a reluctant agreement to help another traveller became a surprising lesson in accepting help herself, and in how firmly a stranger can stand beside you when travel has emptied your reserves. Let's get into it. By the time I landed in Jakarta, I was already tired enough that even simple tasks felt irritating. You know those travel days when nothing catastrophic has happened, but every small inconvenience seems to arrive holding hands with another one? It was one of those. I had a connecting flight to Yogyakarta, and the original plan was straightforward. Land in Jakarta, wait a reasonable amount of time, catch the next flight, and arrive at my villa with enough energy left to shower, unpack, and find something to eat. Instead, I landed and discovered that my connecting flight had been cancelled and moved to later that evening. Much later. I was now looking at a 7.5-hour layover. That alone would have been annoying, but manageable. Airports are built for waiting, after all. You find a seat, buy something overpriced, charge your phone, and accept that your day is no longer your own. Except this time, for the first time in all my travels, I was told I had to collect my checked luggage and recheck it for the domestic flight. I understand that I was transferring from an international flight to a domestic one. It made sense. But I had never needed to do it before, so I hadn't planned for the possibility that I would spend the next 7.5 hours dragging both my carry-on and my full-size suitcase around with me. I couldn't properly settle anywhere. Every time I needed the bathroom, food, or even a better seat, everything had to come with me. The part of the airport I was in had very limited food choices, and I hadn't eaten anything that day. By that stage, I was hungry enough to be annoyed by the sight of other people eating. There also wasn't much indoor seating available. I kept circling back to the same few areas, hoping someone would leave, but every seat seemed permanently occupied. Eventually, I ended up outside for a large portion of the layover, sitting with my luggage beside me and trying to convince myself that fresh air was exactly what I wanted. It wasn't. I was hot, uncomfortable, and checking the time far too often. Every time I looked, only about 6 minutes seemed to have passed. So I sat there, hungry and sulking quietly, while my patience gradually reduced itself to a low battery warning. Eventually, the time came to recheck my bag and go through the airport process again. There was a brief sense of relief when I handed over the suitcase. At least I was back to carrying only one bag. The flight to Yogyakarta was uneventful, which I appreciated more than I usually would. At that point, uneventful felt luxurious. When we landed, I joined everyone waiting around the luggage carousel. I was exhausted, but I could finally see the end of the day. All I had left to do was collect my bag, book a grab, and get to my villa. I opened the app while I waited and entered the address. That was when I discovered something I probably should have checked before booking my flights. Yogyakarta International Airport is nowhere near central Yogyakarta. The estimate to my villa was roughly 1 hour and 15 minutes. I stared at the screen for a moment, hoping I had entered something incorrectly. I checked the address. I checked the map. I zoomed out and saw the considerable stretch of road between the airport and the city. No mistake. I really was that far away. I know this was completely my fault. I researched plenty of unnecessary details before travelling, yet somehow I had missed the rather important detail of where the airport was. I took a deep breath and tried not to become dramatic about it. An hour and 15 minutes wasn't the end of the world. I would sit in the car, put my headphones on, and eventually arrive. Still, it was difficult not to feel defeated. I had already spent the whole day waiting to get to Yogyakarta, only to discover I still had another substantial journey ahead of me. All I wanted was to reach the villa, lock the door, and stop making decisions. While I was standing beside the carousel, staring at the Grab estimate, a woman approached me. She was French and travelling with her daughter. She asked whether I was heading into the city centre, and if I was, whether I would like to share a ride with them so we could split the cost. My honest, immediate reaction was no. I didn't say it out loud, but every exhausted part of me rejected the idea. Sharing meant organising 3 people, 3 sets of luggage, and 2 separate drop-offs. It meant conversation I didn't feel like talking. It meant potentially travelling farther than necessary if their accommodation came first. Most importantly, I had already imagined myself sitting alone in the back of a car, finally responsible for nobody except myself. I gave them the polite version of hesitation while we compared addresses. They weren't staying near my villa. In fact, they were going to the other side of the city. I immediately started hoping that, if I agreed, my accommodation would be the first stop. I entered both addresses into Grab and checked the route. Thankfully, mine came first. That helped, but it wasn't the only thing that changed my mind. Paying for a solo Grab wasn't a problem for me. I wasn't agreeing because I needed to save money. But if sharing the cost made the journey easier for the 2 of them, I could help. There was also a practical benefit for me. I didn't have any Indonesian rupiah. I could pay for the Grab through the app, and they could give me cash for their portion. That would leave me with some local currency when I arrived in the city. It seemed mutually useful, so I said yes. We collected our bags and headed towards the exit together. I entered both addresses again, checked the vehicle size, and pressed the button to book our ride. Then we stood on the footpath outside the terminal, waiting for a driver to accept. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. Cars appeared and disappeared on the map, but none accepted the trip. Eventually, the app stopped searching and informed me that there were no drivers available in the area. Great. I tried again and got the same result. The French woman and her daughter stood beside me while I moved to the next option. I opened GoJek, entered both destinations, and requested a car. This time, I was given a code and directed to take it to the GoJek desk, where they would confirm a driver for us. That felt promising. At least there was a desk with an actual person who might be able to help. We dragged our luggage over and showed them the code. The person at the desk checked the booking and told us there were currently no drivers in the area. We could wait, but they couldn't tell us when somebody might accept the journey. It was around 8:30 on a Friday night. We were standing outside an airport more than an hour from the city, with our luggage spread around us and no confirmed way to leave. At that point, the 7.5-hour layover started to feel like only the first half of the problem. Several men began approaching us, asking whether we needed a Grab or GoJek. I still had both apps open, with the estimated price visible, so I told them I was happy to book through the app. They weren't interested in that. They wanted to arrange the journey directly and be paid in cash, for about double the price, each. I wasn't automatically against it, especially after being told there were no app drivers available. But I didn't have any cash, and I wasn't going to get into a vehicle without agreeing on the route and the price beforehand. I told the French woman that I didn't have any cash. She told me she had enough cash to cover the journey. She could pay the driver, and I could transfer my share to her. Thankfully, I had my Wise card and account. She could give me rupiah for the driver and I could transfer the equivalent amount to her in euros. Within a couple of minutes, the cash problem was solved. Now we only needed to find somebody willing to drive us. That turned out to be harder than expected. Once the drivers learned that we had 2 different accommodation addresses, their interest dropped. They didn't want to drive all the way into Yogyakarta and then continue to opposite sides of the city. They were all talking to one another, pointing at phones, looking at the map, and debating the trip amongst themselves. We stood in the middle of it, trying to work out whether anyone had actually agreed to take us. One person told us that the trip was possible, but the driver would only make 1 stop. That didn't work for us. None of us was enthusiastic about being dropped at a stranger's accommodation late at night and then needing to find another ride across the city, especially if there was a possibility there would be no Grab drivers available once we got there. I told the French woman that they should accept the ride, and I would just return to the GoJek desk and wait until someone accepted my booking. I didn't know whether that would take 20 minutes or another 2 hours. She immediately rejected that idea. She told the drivers she wouldn't leave me behind, that we would be travelling together to our own accommodations. She was completely matter-of-fact about it. There was no awkward ceremony and no suggestion that I now owed her some enormous favour. To her, it was just the obvious solution to a problem in front of us. Then we were told a driver could take us to both addresses, but he needed a 4th passenger to make the journey financially worthwhile. We agreed. At that stage, the arrangement had already become so disorganised that adding another person barely seemed like a complication. We looked around the airport to see whether anyone else appeared to be stranded. There were people waiting with bags, but we had no idea who needed a ride, where they were going, or whether they'd already booked something. The man we believed was our tentative driver walked away. Nobody clearly explained where he was going. For several minutes, we watched the direction he had disappeared in and wonder whether we had lost him. I started to think we would need to repeat the entire conversation with a new group of drivers. The French woman remained much calmer than I felt. Every time I started drifting back towards the idea of waiting indefinitely for GoJek, she kept us focused on the arrangement we had already made. She asked questions, she confirmed prices, and she made sure both stops were still included. She didn't know me. She had no obligation to make sure I reached my villa. It would have been easier for her and her daughter to accept a single-stop ride and leave me to sort myself out. But she never treated that as an option. About 15 minutes later, the driver returned. He had found a 4th passenger. He told us he would go and get his car and come back for us. Then we waited for another 15 minutes. By this point, I was so tired that I didn't want to celebrate until I was physically sitting inside the vehicle. I kept expecting a fresh complication. The luggage wouldn't fit. Somebody would change the price. The 4th passenger would disappear, or the driver would decide the journey was just too far. But eventually, a car pulled up. We loaded our luggage, climbed in, and confirmed the addresses one final time. Then we were moving. Actually moving. Away from the airport and towards Yogyakarta. I sat in the car watching the airport lights disappear behind us and felt my entire body relax. The French woman and her daughter chatted quietly. The 4th passenger settled in. The driver followed the route into the city. It wasn't the peaceful solo ride I had pictured at the carousel, but I no longer cared. I was simply grateful not to be sitting beneath the airport lights, refreshing GoJek and wondering whether anyone would ever accept my booking. My villa was the first stop, just as the app had predicted. When we arrived, I thanked the 2 women, although the ordinary words felt slightly inadequate after the amount of effort it had taken to get there. It wasn't a long-term friendship, but it was still a meaningful one. There was no promise to meet again during our time in Yogyakarta, or in another country, or to book a future holiday together. We were just 3 travellers whose paths overlapped for one inconvenient journey between an airport and a city. But I've thought about that woman several times since. I originally said yes because I believed I was helping her and her daughter. They could split the fare with me and I could make their journey a little bit cheaper. I didn't realise how quickly our positions would reverse. She was the person who solved the cash problem. She was the one who refused to let me retreat to the GoJek desk and wait alone for an unknown number of hours. She was the one who kept confirming that the driver would take me to my separate accommodation. She looked at my situation and decided I wasn't being left behind. She advocated for me when I was too exhausted to properly advocate for myself. For one chaotic evening, a stranger was firmly on my side. And after the day I'd had, that mattered. Hope restored. That's where the story ends, but not where my thoughts do. I'm sure this story will resonate with a lot of people. I absolutely love the kindness we can experience from strangers, and I agree that these small acts of kindness are what restore our hope in humanity. As a fiercely independent girly myself, I often wonder why we praise independence so heavily that receiving help can feel like we've failed, even when refusing it would only make life harder. Perhaps generosity feels safer when we control which side of it we're standing on. So, my question for you is, are you as open to receiving kindness as you are to giving it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll catch you in next week's episode. Thanks for listening. Make sure you're following along to keep up to date with weekly stories that will inspire, entertain, and maybe even make you fall in love with the idea of love itself. Got your own romance story and want to be a part of the Ginger Romance community? Check the notes for details on how to submit your own.